Oh, well, hello there. Welcome again to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to be talking about language and why language is so very important to the study of anthropology. And to understand a culture, you have to understand its language and the cultural imperatives within that language and all of that stuff, that cool stuff with language. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this. Um, so I think it's fascinating to think about the fact that there are like 7,000 languages in the world today. There are 7,000 languages. There are so many different ways of seeing life. And each language is distinct in its own way, has its own identity and its own history. And so when you think about all of those different ways, it's mind-blowing the different worldviews that people are going to have. You know, we are in this country so centered on the English language, and you know, we occasionally sort of intermingle with other language, oftentimes Spanish as a second language or as a primary language for some folks. And then that's it, right? We rarely ever see any other languages. I've been fortunate that I've seen and worked with a lot of people that have multiple languages, and and it's fascinating to talk and see what their worldview is like, and to try and understand a little bit more about them. So, language is very, very important to our study and our research. So language is a system of communication that uses symbols to convey information, right? Basically, symbols are all kinds of different things. So spoken words, physical gestures, the written word, hieroglyphics, petroglyphs, pictographs, shapes, chemical trails, pheromones. All of these things are used to convey information. Now, things like chemical trails and pheromones humans don't use a lot, or at least not necessarily intentionally, especially like chemical trails. That's usually used by other species to give information about, you need to do this, and so we're going to leave a chemical trail, and you can follow here if you're like an ant or something like that. We don't do a whole lot of it. Sometimes we do, and that can convey different types of information. But pheromones are definitely something that we have incorporated into our natural way of communicating with other folks. The other things like spoken word, physical gestures, right? Those are pretty obvious. Written words, again, fairly obvious about that, but how those words have been created, how we've created written languages, stems from ideas like hieroglyphics and petroglyphs and pictographs. Pictographs are things that have been drawn, usually on like the sides of cliffs. So if we look at like Native American traditions, or any tradition around the world that used a natural canvas, such as like a wall of some sort, a cliff wall, petroglyphs are etched into the stone. Pictographs are drawn on with some sort of an ink. So that's kind of like the distinction we have. And then hieroglyphics are usually, sort of like pictures that convey information. It's like storybook type stuff where you see an event take place, and it helps people to understand an event without actually having to necessarily read into it. And And so there's fascinating ways of being able to convey language. I believe it's in Peru. They had a series of basically like ropes with knots tied into them, and those knots are a way of conveying certain types of information. You know, humans are so capable of coming up with fascinating ways of recording and then disseminating information. And we've come up with so many incredible ways of doing it. So language is often sort of put together in a way that we take small symbols and combine them into larger ones, into larger ones, into larger ones, until they become complex ideas. In this case, you know, we have like a word or a letter that goes in that has a specific sound associated with that letter. And then we take that letter and we turn it into a word, a combination of sounds that then has meaning behind that word that is created. And then we put that into a sentence. And then, you know, and we can create these much larger complex ideas. Hand gestures can oftentimes also be included in that, where we can convey different types of information with the inclusion of like body movements. And then, let's see, to understand how we sort of deal with language, we want to study how the origin of language kind of came about. One of the ways that we do this is through working with primates, and we teach primates different ways of conveying information. So in this case, we've got like gorillas and chimpanzees, Coco being one of the famous gorillas that was taught ASL, or American Sign Language, and is able to communicate, you know, fairly basic ideas and sometimes very complex ideas through sign language, and has been able to help us understand the complexity of the mind and the biological ability to understand language, and how our ancestors would have been able to have comprehended that language, and then how that would have progressed as our own species evolution got us to the point where we're at now. So by understanding language in these other species, helps us to kind of understand our own origin story when it comes to language, and why it's important to do this. And then we've also been able to understand language with other species. There's a documentary out there about dolphins, and this story is so fantastic. I think it was in like SeaWorld in San Diego, and they had a couple of dolphins that had been trained to do all these different tricks, and one day, like, one of the trainers was like, okay, and was talking to these dolphins and told these dolphins to do a series of 10 tricks that they couldn't repeat the tricks, and they had to do them together, but they could choose what tricks they wanted to do. And so literally these two dolphins like went underwater and had a little chat, and then they did these 10 different tricks together. And you sit there and you're like, holy crap, I mean, this is comprehensive understanding of language and the ability to communicate between species. And then you think about in the wild, where if you look at different dolphin pods and possibly even like whale pods around the world, that they have been recording these different dolphin pods and the noises that they make, and come to find out, like, the songs and the way that they speak are different, even though it's like the same species, but in different places around the world they speak differently, and they make different noises, and they communicate to each other in different ways. And that's language, and that's intelligence, and that's like, wow. I mean, seriously, wow. You know, humans have always been considered to be the smartest animals on the planet, and you know, we look at our technology and what we've been able to do and all of that stuff. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. But to think that we're the only ones capable of more complex understanding, more complex ideas, and being able to communicate and convey ideas, you know, we're not the only ones. So I think it's fascinating and super important to remember these kinds of things as we look at nature, and and also try and understand the world around us. And even there's another great story. I heard this on NPR. I think this is a little over a year ago. They were talking about trees and how trees communicate. And it all had to do with chemical, basically like chemical trails. And when one tree was ready to, was growing, and you had like mother and saplings that were basically like the mother tree was like saying, okay, it's time to be able to grow, you know, and was being able to release chemicals into the ground, encouraging the saplings to sprout. And the fact that we can look at this and understand that there is a communication process going on, you know, it might not be considered super intelligent, right, cerebral thinking, but it's still a means of communication that, you know, these plants that we don't necessarily think as being, you know, they're just plants, they're just growing, you know, they're alive, but they're not complex. And maybe they are a little bit more complex. And then maybe we should look for things, look for more complexity within the natural world instead of writing things off and saying that, oh, it's just a plant. Or no, it's just a silly animal. Maybe. Getting back to the idea of like primates, the average like gorilla or chimpanzee can communicate on the same level as like a 2 or 3 year old toddler. And if you've ever been around kids that age, you know that they can be pretty smart. And they've got some very interesting ideas. And can have some very complex ideas about life and their place in it. So it's important to kind of understand that. And it gives us sort of like an idea of how, as a species, we have sort of developed. If we go back and look at our own genetic history and where we sort of have our origins in speech, we know that if we go back a couple million years, we believe that we had the mechanisms, the actual physical capability of having speech. It's one of the differences between like gorillas and chimpanzees and humans, is that our vocal capabilities, like our vocal cords, the shape of our jaw, all of this is tuned so that we can create complex sounds. And the more complex sounds that we've been able to create, the more information we're able to convey. Chimpanzees, gorillas do not have that same complexity, and therefore can't make the same sort of sounds and convey that same kind of information. So, you know, we have to look at the biological aspects of this. If we go back sort of like 150,000 years ago, we sort of see the the current iteration of Homo sapien development, so that our modern speech patterns are there and capable of. It's not that we didn't have it before so much, but that's about the point where we figure we landed on where we are now. So for the last 150,000 years, we have been at this current point of being able to make the sounds that we can make, the biological point. So, and that's pretty complex, right? We've been able to do it, but 150,000 years isn't that long when in the grand scale of things. It wasn't that long ago that modern humans were able to develop. So pretty fascinating that we've been able to do so much given that amount of time. If we go back to about 50,000 years ago is when we start seeing early cave art. And some of this cave art is absolutely amazing in its depictions and its complexity, and when we look at it, we can see that there is definitely some thought going into this process, and I think that's one of the things that we have to understand is that while we might have been capable back then of all the vocalizing, the biological aspect of it, the actual cultural ability to have those understandings might not have been there. We might not have had all those complex ideas. But when we start seeing stuff like this, we start to get an idea of now we're seeing more complex ideas, and we're starting to see that these complex thoughts are being put into a form that can be replicated and can be displayed and shared continuously, through generations. So when we start seeing art like this, we start seeing more complex ideas, and it gives us an idea about how that information can then be conveyed to other people and continual generations. So, talking about descriptive linguistics. Descriptive linguistics is a series of noises, writing, gestures that convey information and oftentimes share a tradition or a collective history. So that's basically the language of a culture, right? The language of a community. And it is what linguistic anthropologists study, right? And I think this is something that, again, we kind of have to understand as well, which people who have studied language in the past and also, even if we get into politics and other things, anthropologists study language not to basically understand language and not how it should be used, okay? And there's kind of a big understanding there. We seek to understand how it's used, how it's conveyed, how it's created, changed, but not how it should be used. And the reason why we tie that in is that within culture, there's oftentimes conflict, right? We've talked about culture and conflict and why we have this continual process of culture change. But language is often at the center of that, right? That there are certain words that are appropriate to use. There are certain accents that are that have more cultural value, right? We'll talk a little bit about that here in a bit. But we don't say whether or not this language should be used, because oftentimes we're not the ones that are trying to make those kinds of calls. That's for the community itself to decide, not necessarily for us to decide. So we're just trying to understand. And that's a lot of what cultural anthropology is about, is trying to understand why, and not necessarily create that culture change, unless we are invited to help create that culture change, right? That's why we have a field of applied anthropology, to kind of help us move in to those areas where we can have a positive impact, but one that is understood and accepted by that community. There are nonverbal types of communication that we also include, so Kinesics and Paralanguages. Kinesics is where we can not only use like verbal cues, but we can use other sounds, or I'm sorry, Kinesics are ways that we can convey information through like movements, through touch, through proxemics, which is basically like the distance between you and your intended target that you're talking to. So Kinesics are like hand gestures. So ASL would be considered Kinesics. Touch, whether or not you're gently touching someone on the shoulder, you're patting them if they're sad or something like that. Or there's other types of touch. Obviously, there's romantic types and there's angry types, and we see how that kind of communication can oftentimes be used. Proxemics, again, can convey different types of information. If I'm up close in your face and I'm angry, I'm right there and I'm like, I'm up in your face, right? Step into my bubble, right? That can give you different types of information. If I'm distant, if I'm, crossing my arms and I'm leaning back like this, maybe I'm not paying as much attention. Maybe I'm not, maybe I'm closed off. There's lots of ways that you can convey different types of information. Our faces are one of the major ways that we can convey emotional information. When we're talking to someone, we oftentimes pay attention to a person's eyes, or if they've got a smile on their face, or the angle of their face, whether they're looking down or if they're looking up, if they're looking at the side. However, the face is a great way of telling emotions. And there's other ways, and other cultures deal with that in different ways. In American culture, right, we are taught to, when we're talking to someone, we look them in the eyes, right? That's the appropriate response when somebody is talking to you, to let them know that you are engaged in the conversation. You make eye contact. Now, when I was working on the Ute Mountain Reservation, having eye-to-eye contact was oftentimes a sense of disrespect, right? If I were to have a conversation with someone, and I had a number of these with community elders, we would often talk, but instead of looking each other in the eye, we would be sort of talking to each other side by side. And for them, they wanted you to hear the words that were being spoken, not necessarily focus on what's going on the face, because the face, they felt, could be deceiving, right? This could be something that could be deceiving. So it was more important to listen to the words. And so having that conversation would oftentimes be two people side by side. You wouldn't be looking each other in the eyes. And so it's a different way of understanding the world. It's a different cultural way of conveying information and how that information should be received, right? So it was a different sign of respect. So and that can create cultural problems, right? So if you walk into if you're a Native American from the Ute Mountain Tribe and you walk into say a lawyer's office, or you have to go in front of a judge, or you're going to a bank, you want to get a loan, or a police officer or something like that, and you don't make eye contact, and you don't show what Westerners would say is the appropriate response, right? Even though for your culture this is the appropriate response, this culture says it's not. And if you don't do those things, you're not engaging in the proper language, and you can have those communication differences, and you can have miscommunication. And so the job of the cultural anthropologist is oftentimes to figure out what those miscommunications would be, when you're going in between cultures. Another example is shaking hands. Okay, if I go down onto the reservation and I'm meeting somebody there, and I shake their hand, in our culture, when you go out and you meet someone, you get a big old grip and you get in there and you squeeze, you squeeze, and you want to show the person that you're shaking hands with that you're tough and you've got a good grip, right? It's a sign of respect. It's also a sign of dominance. I've got a good grip and I'm a man, right? Down there, not so much, right? Basically, you go up and if you're going to shake hands, you're basically just going up and kind of, pressing palms. That's it. That's the amount of pressure that you use. If you grip too hard, it's a sign of disrespect. But if you're just touching palms, there's no violence involved, right? And I've met a number of folks that from working down there that are accustomed with working within the westernized world, and when you shake their hand, they grip your hand like a Westerner does. They go in and they grab your hand and shake it, and it's like, yeah, they're accustomed to what it's like to listen or to communicate and to deal with Westerners. So, and it's these little things that you pick up as an anthropologist, and how people communicate, and why it's important to be able to recognize how people communicate differently, and especially when they communicate in a way that might seem disrespectful in your culture but is not in theirs. And so you have to put things into context. Paralanguage is usually something that comes along with your standard language. So like in this case, we have things like noises, okay, that don't necessarily have an actual context and a descriptor. So if I like a word, so if I'm like laughing, okay, if I make a joke and people are laughing and talking about it, that laughter is an indicator. It's a way of communicating, but it's nothing more than noises, right? There isn't any particular word that's associated with that laughter. Or crying, right? That's an emotional way of communicating tears of joy, tears of sorrow, tears of rage, right? These are all things that can convey different types of information, yells and stuff like that. So paralanguage are oftentimes other means of conveying information along with sort of the traditional, using speech or hand gestures, anything like that. Texting. And I think texting is a relatively new form of communication, especially for like the last 20 some odd years. And I think it's really cool because it's an amalgamation of traditional letter writing, right? But it's oftentimes extremely abbreviated. I remember when I got my first cell phone, and I was 20 when I got my first cell phone. And texting was really cool. It was a lot of fun. It was a quick way to convey information. But one of the issues that we have with texting is that it's all nonverbal, right? And it doesn't convey emotion, right? It's just words. And oftentimes, because texting is so abbreviated, there's not a lot of descriptors going on. And that can lead to a lot of miscommunication, which is why we started using different ways of adding in like emojis, right? The first emojis out there, they weren't cute little icons and stuff. They were, a colon or semicolon and a bracket, right? Showing like a smiley face. And all of a sudden, people started figuring that out, that they could create different different ways of conveying information, being able to draw a heart or something like that could convey feeling, not just the words, not having to spell it all out, but to actually send a picture along with it. So early texting was an issue. It was a great way of conveying quick information, but not necessarily emotional information. And I experienced this firsthand. I had a girlfriend a long time ago that her only mode of communication was through text, and it created quite a few issues because there was a lot of miscommunication between us, and that can be an issue when you're not able to convey that emotional context to a message, right? Where if we were to talk on the phone, you could hear my voice and the inflection in my voice, and if I were angry or sad or if I was happy or whatever, right? You can get that. In this case, texting has had a lot of limitations placed upon it, which is why they did emoticons and stuff like that, and why it's becoming such a huge part of our world now, because texting also influenced like instant messaging, online, through Facebook, through being able to comment on social media, and it's become pervasive throughout all of our multimedia landscape. And so it helps us to, convey different types of information that wasn't always there. The other thing about texting, and certainly with like emojis and stuff like that, is that it can also convey information, but not necessarily always in a truthful way. Have you ever sent like a text message that you put a smiley face on there, but you weren't really smiling, right? You're like, oh, I'm okay, and then smiley face, but you're not really okay, right? So it can basically act as a way of communicating falsehoods, right? Again, because you're not there to see the emotional response on people's faces when you're communicating, or hear the inflection in your voice when you're actually listening to the words. So, texting is a great form of communication. Just don't use it for everyday life. It can be bad. It can ruin a lot of things. So friendly piece of advice there. I think this is probably one of the most important aspects of language. It literally determines how we think. It determines our reality. Human language shapes our culture. Our thoughts determine our reality. Okay? The only way that we see and understand the world around us is through the words we have to describe it. Okay, so when I look at mountains and I look at the environment, and when I look at people, I can only use the words that I have learned to describe those things. If I have a very complex understanding of that subject that I'm looking at, then I have a more complex way of describing it and understanding that topic. If I don't, right, if I've got very basic understanding of it, the complexity changes. So understanding that how our language is so important in our understanding of the world. And that's how most cultures are, is that their language determines their reality and what's important to them. Throughout the years, lots of different scholars have spent time trying to understand how language is conveyed and how it's understood and all of this stuff. It's never been fully understood because we don't have the means of understanding how language has been conveyed. We've lost so much information in the past, and we didn't always have a written record. We've only kept written records going back, maybe I think some of our earliest forms about 10,000 years ago. If we look back at early Sumerian and then Babylonian cuneiforms, right? The earliest known writing that we have, and that predates Egyptian hieroglyphics. Hi, Bear. Hi. It predates sort of our basic understanding of how information has been conveyed. And so understanding how it all changes and how it originated has always been a fun thing to contemplate, and other people take it very seriously. So let's see. Understanding how the environment impacts language development is also really important to understand. I think I've mentioned this before. If you go to like the Inuit in northern Canada or Alaska, in the subarctic regions, and you ask them to describe snow, they might have 40 different words for snow, right? Because there's 40 different types of snow in their existence. That, you've got this type of snow that comes in, and then you've got a different type. And we, as Americans, and especially in Colorado, we might have like 10 or 12 different types of ways of describing snow. Because snow is a big part of our lives here, right? Especially if you like to go up and do skiing or snowboarding or anything like that. We have different types of snow that we recognize. But for the Inuit, right, those 40 different ways of describing snow might help them determine what's safe or not safe, right? If they see a particular type of snow falling down, they know that, bad weather is on its way, right? It might be able to give them an understanding and be able to help them survive. And so that becomes really important to have that complex idea about their environment and being able to describe that environment in very complex ways. If we look at American culture, we have things like cars. We have 40 different ways of describing cars. So that can help us understand cultural imperatives, right? What's really important to a community. one of the great uh, languages that I think is a fantastic way of describing a language are the Western Apache, right? The Western Apache oftentimes use locations to describe events, right? And to describe different ideas or different concepts. So they might have a location and they'll be sitting having a conversation with people, and one of them will say, "Oh, you know, the pass up there with the two trees and the rattlesnake." And everybody knows where that pass is with the two trees and the rattlesnake is. You know, it's a very specific location. It's a culturally important location. And they know that there's a story at that location, that with these, somebody had an encounter with a rattlesnake and there's a moral associated with that, and that whole place conveys an idea. And when you mention that, right, it conveys these certain ideas about this. And so in the conversation, all you have to do is mention that location. Now, like Western culture and American culture, we have a number of these as well. You know, when you mention 9/11, right? 9/11 is one of those concepts that conveys all kinds of different types of information. So, if I mention 9/11, we think about New York, we think about the Twin Towers, we think about terrorism, we think about war, we think about all these different things that are associated with 9/11. Well, the Western Apache, a good portion of the language is connected to these locations that you can convey all different types of ideas and concepts through these different locations. And so it's fascinating to think about understanding the world through geographical location, and it's just a different way of seeing your environment, seeing your world. I think it's fantastic. Language is also very fluid, constantly changing, constantly adapting to new ideas, new conditions, because humans are complex, and we are, especially in today's age, we are introducing all kinds of new ideas on a constant basis. And so we're adapting to different ideas. And those words, we're oftentimes creating new words and new terms to indicate something going on. If I mention TikTok, right? TikTok, normally when I think TikTok, or 10 years ago, I'd be thinking of a clock, right? TikTok, 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 the seconds of a clock going around. Now when you talk about TikTok, it's a means of conveying 10 seconds of information, kind of like Vines. If you ever watched Vines that were like 5 seconds or 3 seconds or whatever they were, I don't know. I wasn't a big fan. But again, it becomes a different means of communication, and words take on different meanings and adapt in different ways. So we have vocal vocabulary, and I kind of talked a little bit about this, like with the Inuits, 40 different words for snow, our car culture, computer and technology terms constantly changing, constantly adapting into new ideas. And this is where we run into a number of issues too, like doctors, right? Doctors have a focal vocabulary that deals with medicine. If you go into a doctor's office and you talk to a doctor and they, talk about this and this and this and this and this and this, and they're using words that you don't normally use in your day-to-day basis, you might not understand. It's still English, right? It's still your language, but they're not in your wheelhouse, right? They're not in the typical way that you understand the world. So you might not really have a great idea about what is actually being discussed. So, understanding that different communities and different aspects of our lives are going to have different centers of vocabulary. Gamers are going to have a focal vocabulary, that there are different terms that are going to be used that might not be a part of the standard English language over here, but it's this subculture over here that uses these terms. And most industries have this, right? Most industries have these words that are specific to that environment. We're going to take a break. This is a good stopping point. So we'll come back in a few minutes. Well, it'll be a few minutes for me. It'll be whenever for you. And we'll go from there. Okay, we'll see you in a few.